Hello everyone, here is the overview that everybody's been waiting for of the 9 historical time periods that are part of the newly redesigned AP United States History curriculum. So we're going to go through each of these 9 time periods that are right here. And remember, there is a detailed review, or there will be for all of them, on the channel very shortly. So please make sure you're watching them. This is just going to be a very, very general overview of the trends and major events and issues that are taking place in America during each of these time periods. So for our first one, it is 1491 to 1607. I will read the overview for each of them. On a North American continent controlled by American Indians, contact among the peoples of Europe, the Americas, and West Africa created a new world. The themes here, first of all, the reason why those years were selected. 1491 is 1 year before Columbus came to the New World. And 1607 will be your first permanent English settlement known as Jamestown. So before the English are here, during this time period, which is largely the 1500s, you're going to see the domination of Spanish when it comes to European colonization, and we'll go over that in more detail later. But remember, there are American Indians or natives or indigenous people, depending on how you'd like to refer to them, who are already here. And I do think I learned that there were actually more indigenous Americans living in the continent at this time than there were people in Europe. So much of what we learned for this time period is going to focus on the relationships between the natives who were here and the European colonists and the explorers, and also to learn about the development of the Native American culture, their political systems. They did have advanced civilizations here long before the Europeans arrived. As far as dates, I just gave you the year for Columbus. The first permanent European settlement will be St. Augustine, which will be in Florida by the Spanish. And 1587, that's an approximate year, was the first attempt by the English to colonize here, and that was at Roanoke in between Virginia and North Carolina, which is often referred to as the Lost Colony because we do not know what happened to those colonists who were here. They all disappeared when the leaders came back. So again, the key theme here is natives developing sophisticated civilizations, and then the contact that will take place between the Europeans and the natives who are here. Next, we go to 1607 to 1754. So why were these years selected? 1607 is the founding of the first English permanent colony at Jamestown, which is in Virginia, and 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War. So for this theme, or time period, Europeans and American Indians maneuvered and fought for dominance, control, and security in North America, and distinctive colonial and native societies emerged. So we still want to have respect and appreciation for the Native American identity, but I often think of this time period as what your elementary teachers referred to as the 13 colonies. Often students are a little bit confused about this. We don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, let's have 13 colonies. But during this time period, starting with Jamestown, and then ending over 100 years later with Georgia, you will see the development of British North American colonies. So Jamestown, which was in Virginia, Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts Bay, which were in the New England region. These two will be the first, definitive English colonies, and you're going to see the identity develop. You're going to see the relationships develop between the Native Americans and the colonists, and often that is not, it's a very tense relationship. But the development of 13 colonies is the focus of this point, and the lifestyle that's taking place as we're developing a distinct colonial identity. Now, for our third time period, 1754 to 1800, this will be, I'll read the theme again, or the description. British imperial attempts to reassert control over its colonies and the colonial reaction to these attempts produced a new American republic, along with struggles over the new nation's social, political, and economic identity. Very simply summarized, we start with the French and Indian War. This was a war that the British and the colonists fought together on the same side versus the French and Indians. Once this war is over, the British expect the colonists to pay for the war, even though William Pitt had promised them that Parliament would take care of the cost of the war if they volunteered. So once this war is over, now you will see tensions mount between the colonists and the British. That's why this is your causes of the American Revolution. The revolution, the fighting, the shot heard around the world, will take place at Lexington and Concord. Please remember that the fighting starts in 1775. Then the colonists declare independence. That's after the publication of Common Sense, the pamphlet by Thomas Paine. Then the revolution will be fought. Once the revolution is over and the colonists are victorious, their first form of government will be the Articles of Confederation. And this was a largely states' rights document. They did not want to give too much power to a central authority since they had just lived off of that system. But when the Articles of Confederation fails to be successful, they will regroup. At Philadelphia, a new constitutional convention will take place, and the Constitution that we still use today will be eventually ratified. In the first early years of the country, under President Washington and then President John Adams, 1 and 2, will be known as the Early Republic. Again, there are detailed videos. As I'm doing this, I have this this impulse to want to keep talking more, but you asked for just a general overview. There you have it. All right, next time period will be 1800 to 1848. The new republic struggled to define and extend democratic ideals in the face of rapid economic, territorial, and demographic changes. All right, a lot going on in the early 1800s, first half of the century. We have the election of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson will usher in an era of expansion with his Louisiana Purchase. Remember, from that purchase, we will then go from Louisiana, then we will buy Florida in 1819, Adams-Onis Treaty. We will then eventually annex Texas in 1845. The Oregon Territory will be acquired, and the Mexican Cession after the Mexican-American War. All of those were largely under the presidency of James K. Polk. But during this time period, so we'll just break this down, extending democratic ideals. Many people are going to be fighting for greater democracy. The president that's most known during this time is Andrew Jackson. So actually, I should just go back here and stay with the timeline. Just give me a second. So after Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, we then will have problems related to impressment overseas. That leads to the War of 1812, which will eventually be declared by James Madison's administration. After the war is over, the Federalists disappear as a political party, and we enter a short period known as the Era of Good Feelings. The Era of Good Feelings is when there is one political party, and that party is the Democratic Republicans. This will end with the disputed corrupt bargain election of 1824. That is when Henry Clay allegedly made a deal with John Quincy Adams. After they could not come up with a victor in the Electoral College, Clay told Adams that he will help him get elected if John Quincy Adams made him his Secretary of State, the position one would want to become president in the future. Jackson, who is furious about this because he feels as if the election was stolen for him, will win the next election in 1828. This 20-year time period, where there is also an age of Jacksonian democracy, will take place. That's when you have all those reform movements. So women are fighting. 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention. Early temperance movement is forming. Those utopian societies, more democratic values, more people being able to vote. But obviously the abolitionist movement will be the focal point, and that success will not be felt until 1865. James K. Polk is elected in 1844, and that brings in this manifest destiny term, the belief that we should expand west. I hope that one went well. Sorry if I was a little confusing in the middle. All right. Next, we will go to... Before I go next, I did want to just tell you who these people were. This is Andrew Jackson, the key figure during the time, and then historians often refer to the great triumvirate of congressmen. This is John C. Calhoun, right here. This is Daniel Webster, and this is Henry Clay. Three of the most impressive politicians of the era, none of them of which ever became president. All right. Now we go to 1844 to 1877. What is this overview? As the nation expanded and its population grew, regional tensions, especially over slavery, led to a civil war, the course and aftermath of which transformed American society. So I look at this as we're finishing up Manifest Destiny, so we are expanding, and then it is causes of sectional conflict, sectional meaning north and south, then Civil War, and then Reconstruction. This should be an easily defined time period for you. So 1844 is when Polk is elected. Again, 1846, 1848 is the Mexican-American War. It's always good to know that because that really leads to sectional conflict. With the Mexican cession that we received with the greatest treaty ever, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What do we do with all of this newly acquired land? That answer will be given to us with the Compromise of 1850. And during the 1850s, there are many causes of sectional tensions. There's the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which called for popular sovereignty in those two newly admitted states. Bleeding Kansas will be a key problem. That's with John Brown and the abolitionists fighting the border ruffians. Sumner Brooks incident, the caning of Charles Sumner, who gave that vicious speech against slavery. Dred Scott decision, when slaves were ruled to be property. John Brown, same John Brown, who starts a revolt in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which today is West Virginia, to try to break into an arsenal and arm the slaves. So during the 1850s, tremendous sectional tensions. And I should have also put the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois over the status of slavery. Over the issue of slavery. And 1860, Lincoln is elected. This will lead to South Carolina being the first state to secede from the Union. And several others will follow after the conflict at Fort Sumter. Civil War is 1861 to 1865, and then Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. Again, there's a more detailed video on this time period. Okay, now we go to 1865 to 1898. This is what you guys know as the Gilded Age. Now, let's read the description first. The transformation of the United States from an agricultural to an increasingly industrialized and urbanized society brought about significant economic, political, diplomatic, social, environmental, and cultural changes. I only put a couple of dates here because this entire era, the Gilded Age, will be defined largely by the following. Sorry about that again. Okay, maybe I'll press the pen here. All right, rise of big business. Industrialization is a key aspect of this time period. You are also going to see westward expansion. More people moving and developing the West, which will lead to problems for farmers. You're going to see urbanization. There are going to be the growth of cities with industrialization, the rise of cities and factories. You're going to see conflict with Native Americans. And that's as more white people settle onto the land, the conflict that arises there. You're going to see the rise of the Populist Party. And remember, we talked about this in class. Mark Twain referred to this as the Gilded Age, talking about the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and the government philosophy toward business was laissez-faire. But we don't know how accurate this term is. There were some efforts by the government to regulate with the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, even early with the Homestead Act of giving people 160 acres of free land and giving the railroads subsidies to build out west. So, and of course, one more thing about this time period is going to be the growth of labor unions. I should have put that before the populace because the labor unions and farmers will join this populist party. What I put on the timeline, 1862, is the Homestead Act, but that lasts for over 30 years, trying to encourage people to move out west. First transcontinental railroad is completed in Utah, Promontory Point, Utah. That was actually on Jeopardy last week. In 1869, May 10th, which was on Jeopardy. 1887 is the Dawes Act. That's an attempt to assimilate Native Americans, offering them land as well, free land. However, as individual families, there's a cultural conflict there of the government not understanding how they lived as tribes and nomadic people. 1894, the Pullman strike. That's the one led by Eugene V. Debs after the Panic of 1893. And it shows how the government was on the side of big business as Grover Cleveland forced the workers to go back because they were interfering with the mail. And McKinley ran against William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan gave that famous Cross of Gold speech in which he wanted to back up money with both gold and silver, which was an idea of the Populist Party. All right, moving right along, 1890 to 1945, an increasingly pluralistic United States. They are referring to greater immigration. We are becoming more diverse. Faced profound domestic and global challenges, debated the proper degree of government activism, and sought to define its international role. There's a lot going on during this time period. So, let's break it down. We have imperialism, we have the Progressive Era, World War I, Roaring Twenties, stock market crash, Great Depression, World War II. That's a very basic overview. I started with 1867 because we did purchase Alaska. That was referred to as Seward's Folly during the presidency of Andrew Johnson. And the purchase was referred to as Seward's Folly because they mocked him for buying a big icebox, turned out to have gold and oil. Okay, anyway, that begins this whole era of imperialism as America is being motivated by big business somewhat, and also by the desire to uplift people around the world and to acquire new markets to sell goods and raw materials and to keep up with European countries. Imperialism taking over land will be seen in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The key event for that is the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War in 1898 really is a turning point, as now an American victory will be the springboard for the United States to become a world power. Now, while the age of imperialism is taking place, you're going to see this debate over the role of government. And the debate is, how much government should we need to solve the problems in society? So the progressives, inspired by muckrakers who are writing about the problems, are going to usher in this progressive era. And the president that's known with the progressive era, well, I'll give you all three. Teddy Roosevelt, then Taft, and then Wilson. And these three presidents all support greater involvement of the government in the economy, which is different from the Gilded Age. But remember, recently historians are now debating how much of a difference there was, or should we be combining these two time periods, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, together. 1914 to 1919 is World War I. The United States will not get involved until 1917. Then the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. Let's remember, 1920s, America had three Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. America attempted to be isolationist. Warren G. Harding's slogan was even a return to normalcy, wanting to go back to the way things were before the war. And there's a huge consumer demand with credit. So we're buying things on credit. The economy was strong, at least until the end. The end will be October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashes. President at that time was Herbert Hoover, and then he will be replaced 4 years later by FDR. That ushers in the New Deal. The New Deal completely changes the philosophy of the government again, and now we go to a much more activist, hands-on federal government with all of his New Deal programs. Did the New Deal actually end the Depression? That also can be debated, but the involvement of us, the United States, in World War II definitely stimulated economic development. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States gets involved in the war and ends it with the atomic bombing of Japan in 1945. Very good. All right. Next, 1945 to 1980. This is what we'll be working on in class today. In class this week, assuming you're listening to this Sunday night. After World War II, the United States grappled with prosperity and unfamiliar international responsibilities while struggling to live up to its ideals. I struggled myself with how to break this down because there's just so much going on in America during this time period. I'm going to do my best here to summarize it, but I'll go into much more detail in class. And I did give you the presidents during the time as well. But let's think of it this way. First, 1945, the United Nations is created. So that's the world affairs significance. We're trying to promote greater world peace since the United States didn't join the League of Nations after World War I. Now, 1950, we'll do this by decade first. 1950s will be a more conservative time. That will be the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, although it starts with Truman, but a more conservative time in America. Now we go to the 1960s, and you'll see a more liberal time in America. That's Kennedy and Johnson. Remember, for Johnson, his Great Society programs, probably the most liberal in America domestic policy other than the New Deal. Then we go to the 1970s, and we're really struggling as a nation because of the economy. The economy was not good during this era. We also are struggling with our faith in the government because of the Watergate scandal. So that is under Nixon. So Americans are not trusting the government at this time. So I hope that breaks it down. What I put here, the baby boom has such an immediate impact on the country and long-term impact on the country as the explosion of the population impacts us. 1960s election of JFK, he defeated Nixon. These were your first televised debates. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution will lead to our involvement in the Vietnam War. As I'm doing this, I realize I should have put 1950 to 53 is the Korean War. Sorry about that. 1968 is always considered a turning point for the following. Beginning of the year, the Tet Offensive takes place, shown on TV. Americans are not confident with the Vietnam War, leads to greater protesting. LBJ announces he's not going to run for re-election, which was a very big deal. Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. Then Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in 1968. Democratic Convention is tremendous upheaval at the time, and it leads to the election of Nixon. After Watergate, Nixon resigns in 1974, and also during this whole time period, do not forget the Civil Rights Movement, the African American Civil Rights Movement. And again, we're going to do this in much more detail in another video and in class. Your final time period is the one we're living through now, 1980 to the present, as the United States transitioned to a new century filled with challenges and possibilities. It experienced renewed ideological and cultural debates, sought to redefine its foreign policy, and adapted to economic globalization and revolutionary changes in science and technology. So let's definitely emphasize the conservative time period of the Reagan Revolution. And Ronald Reagan, along with his Vice President George Bush, will oversee in the 1980s a strong economy. Remember, Reaganomics is tax cuts for the wealthy, supply side economics or trickle down. The debate is how effective were these tax cuts. The economy was strong in the 80s, but then we suffered a little bit after that. There's going to be culturally during the 80s a group called the Moral Majority, something I'll go over in class as an example. The gay rights movement really has a beginning in 1969 with the Stonewall riots in New York City. The Moral Majority, this conservative era, is going to try to go back to like a more conservative moral agenda. But then, since it's to the present, we all know that there has been tremendous strides in equality for the gay and lesbian community. And we'll find out the Supreme Court's decision on the gay marriage ruling this June. Now, after Reagan and Bush, we then have the Clinton era. Clinton was the last president to oversee a surplus, but Clinton is also the president that repealed Glass-Steagall. I think we all know the September 11th attacks and the impact that has on the country, and the election of Barack Obama. For me, this time period, I want to focus on globalization, and this book, The World is Flat, where Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist, he outlined 10 changes that are taking place in the world, or that have already taken place, that have leveled the playing field, that we are so interconnected today, and while we may want to fight those forces, we can't. So instead, we really have to adapt, and the countries that do adapt are the ones that are going to be the most successful. And lastly, who will be the next president after Obama? Will it be Rand Paul? Will it be Ted Cruz? Will it be Hillary Clinton? Will it be Marco Rubio? Those are the only ones I'm willing to write at this moment, since they're the only ones that have officially announced their presidential aspirations. So that's the overview. I hope that helps everybody, and keep up the good work in studying, and I will see you in class soon.